Blood spattered the church bell as Private Miller rang out the warning. 12 men, 5 days. Hundreds of Germans surrounding American troops held a French village for 5 days, with only 12 men. No radio contact, supplies dwindling. Lieutenant Hayes counted ammunition while villagers huddled in cellars below. Each man knew retreat meant massacre. The village must hold, their lives for hundreds of others. The impossible stand that history nearly forgot, and you need to witness. The raw grit of men pushed beyond breaking, who somehow didn't break. Lieutenant James Hayes wiped fog from the church tower window and stared into the grey dawn that shrouded the small French village of Merville. The cobblestone streets, still slick with last night's rain, remained eerily empty as mist curled between the half-timbered buildings that had stood for centuries before this war came to tear the world apart. He had arrived with 30 men just 3 days ago, an advanced reconnaissance unit meant to secure the village until the main force arrived to continue the push eastward. Now, as the haunting silence was broken only by the distant rumble of artillery, he stood with just 11 men under his command, the radio operator frantically trying to re-establish contact with headquarters on a device that produced nothing but crackling static and hollow silence. The message that had come through before communications went dead still echoed in Hayes's mind. German forces had broken through unexpected sectors, the planned reinforcements were diverted south, and his unit was effectively on their own until further notice. A notice that might never come. The church bell tower, the highest point in the village, offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside, the rolling fields and dense forests now holding unseen threats rather than the pastoral beauty they once represented. Through his binoculars, Hayes spotted the first signs of movement along the eastern tree line, methodical, disciplined, unmistakably military. His stomach tightened as he counted the advancing figures, then stopped when the number grew too large to maintain any hope. Private Miller climbed the narrow stone steps to the tower, his boots echoing in the sacred silence, his young face already etched with the premature lines of war that transform boys into haunted men overnight. "Lieutenant, Sergeant Ross sent me to report. We've completed the inventory as ordered," he said, his voice low as if the advancing Germans might hear him from their distance. 37 grenades, 1,800 rounds of ammunition, 4 days of rations if we stretch them, medical supplies for maybe 3 serious injuries. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing with the brutal arithmetic of their situation. "Not enough, sir. Not for what's coming." Hayes turned from the window, studying Miller's face. The private was barely 20. A farm boy from Nebraska who had joined up after Pearl Harbor with dreams of heroism that the brutal reality of war had already begun to erode. "It will have to be enough, Miller," Hayes replied, his voice steady despite the cold fear settling in his chest. "I need you to help the villagers move to the wine cellars beneath the square. Anyone who can't fight needs to be underground before nightfall." He returned to the window, to the growing number of shadows emerging from the tree line like spectres. "Tell Sergeant Ross to gather the men in the church. We have decisions to make." As Miller departed, Hayes remained at his post, watching as the German advance paused at the edge of the open fields surrounding Merville. They were being cautious, perhaps suspecting a larger American force than the skeleton crew that actually remained. The village sat at a crucial crossroads. Whoever controlled it controlled the movement of troops and supplies across a 20-mile stretch of contested territory. Hayes understood the strategic value, but strategy seemed like a luxury when outnumbered 20-1, with no reinforcements in sight. He traced his finger along the map spread before him, the paper worn at the creases from constant folding and unfolding, as if the terrain might offer some secret advantage he had overlooked. The ancient church bells rang out 3 times, a signal to the scattered American soldiers to assemble, the sound hanging in the damp air long after the brass had stopped swinging. Hayes took one last look at the countryside. at the enemy gathering like storm clouds on the horizon before descending the spiral staircase to meet his men. Each step downward felt like moving closer to an inevitable end, yet somewhere between fear and resignation, a stubborn resolve was taking root. 12 men, 1 village, 5 days to hold out against an overwhelming force, impossible odds by any military calculation. But as the faces of his remaining men looked up at him from the wooden pews, Hayes realized that calculation and combat were different beasts entirely. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling of the old church, "what we lack in numbers, we'll make up for in knowing exactly what we're fighting for. These people, this ground, each other. Datu." The village of Merville seemed to hold its breath as twilight descended, casting long shadows across the cobblestone square where Sergeant Ross had organized their meager defenses. The 12 American soldiers worked with grim efficiency, transforming the picturesque French hamlet into a fortress of improvised barricades and concealed firing positions. Ancient wooden carts, reinforced with sandbags, blocked the 3 main streets leading into the village center, while empty wine barrels filled with rubble created choke points that would force any attacking force to funnel through carefully selected kill zones. The villagers who remained above ground, mostly older men who refused evacuation and insisted on defending their homes, moved through the deepening gloom with bundles of ammunition and supplies, their faces etched with a determination that transcended language barriers. Private Cooper, the unit's medic, had converted the village bakery into a makeshift aid station, its large stone ovens still radiating heat that provided the only warmth against the autumn chill that crept through the cracks in the mortar and stone. The sweet scent of bread that had once filled the space was now replaced by the antiseptic smell of medical supplies, a jarring contrast that seemed to underscore the transformation of this once peaceful community. Cooper methodically arranged his limited medical supplies on flour-dusted counters, categorizing them by urgency rather than abundance, his hands moving with practiced precision even as his eyes repeatedly drifted to the windows and the darkness gathering beyond the glass. Lieutenant Hayes had established the command center in the back room of the village tavern, its thick stone walls offering protection against both artillery and eavesdropping. Maps covered the heavy wooden table where empty wine bottles now served as paperweights rather than vessels of celebration. The room's single oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the terrain charts as Hayes plotted defensive positions, marking fields of fire with pencil lines that seemed painfully thin against the vastness of the German forces they would soon face. Sergeant Ross stood beside him, his weathered face impassive as he traced potential enemy approaches with a calloused finger, the silver streaks in his dark hair testament to campaigns fought across North Africa and Italy before this quiet village became their latest battlefield. "They'll come at first light," Ross murmured, his voice gravelly from years of shouting orders over the din of combat. "They always do. The dawn gives them just enough visibility without making them easy targets." His finger circled the eastern approach, where dense forest gave way to open farmland. "This is where they'll mass their main force. The trees provide cover for assembly, but they'll have to cross 200 yards of open ground to reach us." Hayes nodded, making additional notations on the map while calculating the terrible mathematics of their situation. 12 men with limited ammunition against what reconnaissance suggested was at least a company-strength element of battle-hardened German. Infantry. Outside, the villagers had begun to sing softly as they worked alongside the soldiers, old French resistance songs that spoke of liberation and resilience against occupation. The melodies drifted through the narrow streets like ghosts of hope, somehow making the stark reality of their situation both more poignant and more bearable. Private Wilson, the youngest of Hayes's remaining men, paused in his work of setting tripwires to listen, his eyes misting slightly before he roughly wiped his face with a sleeve and returned to his task. At 19, he had never known a world without war, having enlisted the day after his birthday, carrying photographs of parents he hoped to make proud and a girlfriend whose letters he read by flashlight during long nights on watch. As midnight approached, the village fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the soft footfalls of sentries at their posts and the occasional distant rumble of artillery that illuminated the horizon like heat lightning. Hayes made his final rounds, checking each position and speaking quietly with each man, not offering false hope, but reminding them of the critical nature of their stand, that holding this crossroads even for a few days could provide the time needed for Allied forces to regroup and establish new defensive lines further west. What he didn't say, what each man already understood, was that their assignment was essentially a delaying action, a sacrifice of 12, so that thousands might gain the precious commodity of time. As Hayes completed his circuit and took up his own position in the church tower that offered the best vantage point across the surrounding countryside, the first flares of the night rose from the German lines, bathing the landscape in an eerie, phosphorescent glow that transformed the familiar terrain into something alien and threatening, a preview of the hell that would break loose with the coming dawn. The morning mist clung to the fields like a shroud, reducing visibility to mere yards and transforming the German soldiers who emerged from its depths into ghostly apparitions that materialized seemingly from nowhere. Private Jenkins, positioned in the attic of a stone cottage at the eastern edge of Merville, was the first to spot them. Dark shapes moving in formation through the pearly haze, their felled-grau uniforms blending with the fog until only their movement betrayed their presence. His finger trembled slightly against the trigger of his M1 Garand as he fought the instinct to fire immediately, remembering Lieutenant Hayes's strict orders to wait until the enemy was within effective range. The moisture in the air dampened sound, creating an unnatural silence, broken only by the soft squelch of boots on mud and the occasional metallic click of equipment being adjusted as the German line advanced with mechanical precision toward the village perimeter. Sergeant Ross moved silently from position to position, his voice a barely audible whisper as he steadied nerves and reminded each man of their assigned sectors of fire. "Remember your training," he murmured to Wilson, who was visibly shaking as the enemy drew closer. "Breathe before you squeeze. Make every round count." In the church tower, Hayes tracked the German advance through binoculars, noting with grim satisfaction that they were indeed approaching along the eastern route as predicted, apparently unaware of the carefully prepared killing field they were entering. He raised his hand, holding it suspended in the air as he waited for the perfect moment when the advancing troops would be fully committed to the open ground with minimal cover for retreat. The signal came as a sharp whistle that cut through the morning stillness. 3 short blasts that had been prearranged as the command to open fire. What followed was a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction, as 12 American rifles spoke as one, supplemented by the heavier chatter of their single Browning machine gun, positioned to sweep the main approach. The effect on the German line was immediate and devastating. The front ranks seemed to crumple in unison as if a giant hand had swept them aside, while those behind scattered in momentary confusion before training reasserted itself and they dove for what little cover the open field offered. The morning mist, previously so peaceful, was now punctuated by muzzle flashes and the acrid smell of cordite that drifted back over the village on the light breeze. Private Miller, serving as Hayes's runner, scrambled up the church tower steps with remarkable agility despite the weight of ammunition boxes he carried. "Sir, Sergeant Ross reports the eastern approach is temporarily clear, but they're regrouping in the tree line," he gasped, his young face streaked with sweat despite the morning chill. "Cooper says we have 2 walking wounded. Jenkins took some shrapnel from a grenade, but insisted on returning to his post, and Thompson has a flesh wound to his shoulder, but can still handle his rifle." Hayes nodded grimly, mentally adjusting his already thin defensive line to account for men who would now be fighting at reduced capacity. He knew this first assault was merely a probing action, the Germans testing their defenses before committing their main force. By mid-morning, the pattern had established itself. Waves of German infantry would advance, be met with concentrated American fire, then fall back to regroup before trying again from a slightly different angle. The Americans, severely outnumbered but enjoying the advantage of prepared positions and intimate knowledge of the terrain, shifted their defense to meet each new thrust. Private Wilson, who had been so nervous before the first exchange of fire, now operated with the cold efficiency of a veteran, his earlier fear transformed into a focused determination that Sergeant Ross noted with approval. The village itself seemed to be a participant in the battle, its ancient stones absorbing bullets and shrapnel, its narrow streets confusing enemy movements, its very layout a defense mechanism centuries older than the current conflict. As the sun reached its zenith, burning away the last of the morning mist to reveal the true extent of the carnage on the field surrounding Merville, Hayes called his men together in rotating groups of 3. Ensuring the perimeter remained manned, while allowing each soldier a brief respite and a chance to replenish ammunition and water. The faces that gathered around him in the cool dimness of the church basement were transformed from those of the previous evening, smudged with gunpowder, etched with the strange mix of exhilaration and horror that combat produces, yet showing a newfound cohesion that transcended their disparate backgrounds and ages. "They've tested our strength and found it greater than expected," Hayes told them, his voice low, but carrying the weight of authority that had been earned rather than merely assigned. "But they'll come again before dusk, and they'll come in force. We've bloodied their nose, gentlemen, which means they'll return with a personal grudge alongside their tactical objective." As if to punctuate his assessment, the distant rumble of vehicles could be heard approaching from the east, the grinding gears and squeaking tracks of mechanized infantry that would soon join the assault, escalating the battle for Merville from desperate to nearly impossible. Darkness fell across Merville like a merciful veil, temporarily obscuring the devastation that the day's fighting had wrought upon the once picturesque village. The eastern approach, where the heaviest German assaults had been concentrated, was now a churned wasteland of shell craters and abandoned equipment, the bodies of fallen soldiers from both sides lying in the eerie stillness that only death can perfect. Inside the village perimeter, the American defenders moved like phantoms through the rubble-strewn streets, their exhausted movements guided more by instinct than vision, as they repositioned to counter the threats that would inevitably come with the new day. The distant glow of German campfires dotted the tree line like malevolent stars, each pinpoint of light representing dozens of enemy soldiers preparing for the next push that would surely overwhelm the dwindling American resistance. Lieutenant Hayes slumped against the crumbling wall of what had once been the village school, now a collapsed heap of timber and stone after taking a direct hit from a German mortar round. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat and caked with the fine dust that permeated everything after buildings disintegrated under bombardment. Using a canteen sparingly, he allowed himself 3 measured sips of tepid water before passing it to Private Cooper, who had been working tirelessly to tend the wounded throughout the day's fighting. The medic's hands, usually so steady, now trembled slightly as he raised the canteen to his lips, the accumulated stress of treating injuries with dwindling supplies beginning to take its toll on his professional composure. 4 men left who aren't wounded," Cooper reported softly, his voice barely audible above the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle, as German sharpshooters probed the American positions under cover of darkness. "Thompson's wound is infected. I've got him on our last sulfur tablets, but without proper medical evacuation." His voice trailed off, the unspoken prognosis hanging in the air between them. Hayes nodded grimly, adding this information to the mental calculus of their deteriorating situation. Ammunition at 30% of starting capacity, food supplies that would last another 2 days at most, and now a fighting force effectively reduced to 1/3 of its already inadequate strength. Yet despite these brutal realities, the objective remained unchanged. Hold Merville, control the crossroads, buy time for the main Allied forces to establish defensive positions further west. Through the shattered window of their temporary command post, Hayes could see Sergeant Ross organizing the night's defenses, his hulking silhouette moving purposefully among the remaining able-bodied men and the villagers who had volunteered to support them. Ross had a remarkable ability to communicate even with those who spoke no English, using gestures and the universal language of shared danger to coordinate their efforts. Under his direction, villagers as young as 12 and as old as 70 moved ammunition, reinforced barricades, and even took up positions as spotters, their intimate knowledge of every cellar and rooftop providing intelligence that no military map could offer. Hayes felt a surge of something approaching hope as he watched this improvised force work with quiet determination in the darkness, creating a defense that transcended mere military tactics. Around midnight, as a thin sliver of moon occasionally penetrated the cloud cover to cast weak silver light across the contested ground, Private Miller returned from his reconnaissance patrol, slipping through the German lines with the silent grace that had made him the unit's most effective scout. His face, streaked with mud applied as camouflage, was set in an expression that combined excitement with dread as he crouched beside Hayes and unfolded a rough map drawn on the back of a ration carton. "They've brought up additional forces, sir," he whispered, his finger tracing the positions he had marked. "At least a full battalion now, with half-tracks and what looks like 2 Panzertürfis positioned here and here." He indicated locations at the northeastern and southeastern approaches to the village, where the tanks would have clear fields of fire across the open ground that the Americans would need to cross if they attempted withdrawal. The news settled over Hayes like a physical weight, the reality of their tactical situation now evolving from desperate to virtually hopeless. Without anti-tank weapons beyond a few grenades and improvised explosives, the introduction of armor to the battlefield effectively eliminated any possibility of either holding their position indefinitely or executing an orderly retreat. As if sensing his commanding officer's thoughts, Miller added in a hushed tone, "There's something else, sir. I overheard officers speaking. They're waiting for additional forces before launching a coordinated assault at dawn. They don't know our strength." A faint smile flickered across his dirt-streaked face. "They think we're at least a company, maybe more. Our defense has them spooked." Hayes absorbed this information, turning it over in his tactical mind as he studied the rough map Miller had provided. The Germans' overestimation of American forces presented a potential advantage. One final card to play in a game where every other hand seemed to favor the enemy. "Find Sergeant Ross," he ordered, a plan beginning to form in the exhausted recesses of his mind. "Tell him to gather every able man, including the villagers who can handle a weapon, at the church in 20 minutes. And Miller," he added as the private turned to go, "make sure everyone brings whatever explosives we have left. We're going to give our German friends a night to remember." Until, as the improvised force assembled in the shattered remains of the village church, its stained glass windows now merely empty frames that allowed the night air to flow freely through the once sacred space, Hayes outlined a plan born of desperation, yet tempered with the cold logic of their situation. They would use the darkness and the Germans' uncertainty about their numbers to launch a limited offensive operation, not to break out, which would be suicide against superior forces, but to create confusion and further reinforce the enemy's misconception about American strength. Small teams would infiltrate German positions, plant explosives, eliminate key personnel, and withdraw before coordination could be established. By dawn, if successful, the enemy would be facing not only a supposedly larger force than actually existed, but one that appeared to be growing more aggressive rather than weakening. As Hayes concluded his briefing, a strange calm settled over the assembled men. the fatalistic acceptance that often comes when all options except the most audacious have been eliminated. They dispersed into the darkness like shadows given purpose, carrying with them the slim hope that courage and deception might accomplish what conventional tactics could not against overwhelming odds. The fifth dawn broke over Merville with an almost cruel serenity, golden light spilling across the devastated landscape, as if nature herself were indifferent to the human suffering that had transformed this once peaceful corner of France. Lieutenant Hayes, his uniform now more dirt than fabric, watched the sunrise from a partially collapsed wall that had once been part of the village bakery, the stones still retaining the faintest scent of bread beneath the more pervasive odors of cordite and decay. The night's operations had succeeded beyond reasonable expectation. German command posts had been hit, communications disrupted, and enough confusion sown to delay the coordinated assault that intelligence had indicated would come at first light. Yet Hayes harbored no illusions about what this temporary success meant in the larger context of their situation. They had bought hours, perhaps, but not the salvation that only substantial reinforcements could provide. Sergeant Ross approached through the rubble-strewn street, moving with the careful precision of a man conserving his last reserves of energy after days without proper rest or nourishment. His right arm was bound in a makeshift sling fashioned from a torn shirt, a souvenir from the night's activities behind enemy lines, but his eyes remained alert and assessing as he surveyed their constantly shrinking perimeter. "Final ammunition count," he reported without preamble, his voice a hoarse whisper that spoke of throats parched by dust and the acrid smoke that hung in the air like a persistent ghost. 43 rounds per man for rifles, 18 grenades total, about 200 rounds for the Browning, and that's being generous. He paused, allowing the implications to settle between them like the fine ash that coated every surface. "The men are asking what the plan is, sir. They know we can't hold another day." Hayes nodded, acknowledging both the tactical assessment and the underlying question about his intentions as their commanding officer, the unspoken truth that had guided their defense for 5 impossible days, that they were effectively a sacrifice to buy time for larger strategic objectives, now demanded acknowledgement as they approached what would almost certainly be their final stand. "Get everyone to the church," he ordered, his decision crystallizing even as he spoke the words. "Everyone who can walk or be carried. The villagers too. We make our stand there together." The church, with its thick stone walls and central position in the village, offered the best defensive position for a last-ditch effort, a final redoubt where they might yet extract the maximum cost from the enemy forces that would soon envelop them completely. The gathering in the church had the solemn quality of a funeral, though whether for themselves or for the village they had defended beyond all reasonable expectation, none could say with certainty. The wounded were positioned near the altar, where Cooper continued to minister to them, with supplies now reduced to strips of cloth torn from vestments and altar cloths, and water collected in helmets during the previous night's brief rainfall. The remaining able-bodied soldiers, a grand total of 5 including Hayes and Ross, took up positions at the windows and doorways, distributing their meager ammunition with the methodical care of men measuring out their own lives in brass and lead. The villagers who had remained, mostly the elderly and a few stubborn souls who refused to abandon their homes, moved between the defenders, offering what little food remained and words of encouragement in a mixture of French and broken English that somehow bridged the gap between disparate cultures united now in their common peril. Private Wilson, his boyish features now gaunt with exhaustion and smeared with the grime of battle, knelt beside an elderly Frenchman who was carefully loading cartridges into a magazine. The old man had fought in the previous war, he explained through gestures and the few shared words they possessed, and now found himself defending the same soil against the same enemy a generation later. There was something profoundly moving in the way his gnarled hands, twisted with arthritis, still remembered the motions of warfare. muscle memory transcending the years of peace that had briefly separated one global conflict from another. Wilson listened to the old man's murmured French, not understanding the words, but comprehending perfectly the emotions behind them. Pride, resignation, determination, a complex blend that mirrored his own tumultuous feelings as they prepared for what would likely be their last day alive. The expected German assault began just past noon, heralded by a barrage of mortar fire that bracketed the church with devastating accuracy, sending chunks of ancient stone cascading from the belfry and punching holes through the roof that had stood intact through centuries of European turbulence. Hayes had positioned his remaining machine gun in the choir loft, where it commanded approaches from multiple directions, with Miller as its gunner. The young private had shown a natural aptitude for the weapon that made him their most effective remaining firepower. As the mortar barrage lifted, the first wave of German infantry emerged from the smoke and dust, advancing in disciplined formation toward the church from 3 directions simultaneously. The American defenders held their fire until the enemy was within lethal range, then unleashed a synchronized volley that momentarily staggered the German line before superior numbers allowed them to resume their inexorable advance. Hours blended together in a cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and the more intimate sounds of men fighting at close quarters as the Germans gradually forced their way into the village square surrounding the church. Hayes moved constantly between positions, redistributing ammunition, dragging wounded men to safer locations, and offering the quiet encouragement that leadership demands even, perhaps especially, in the most hopeless situations. Through a shattered window, he could see German officers directing the encirclement of their final position, the methodical deployment suggesting they still believed they were facing a much larger American force. There was a certain grim satisfaction in this realization that 12 men had convinced an enemy battalion they were fighting against company strength or greater, but it offered little practical comfort as their ammunition dwindled round by precious round. As dusk approached, casting long shadows across the bullet-scarred interior of the church, where American and French defenders had been compressed into an increasingly tight perimeter around the altar, Hayes allowed himself a moment of reflection amid the chaos of combat. They had accomplished their mission beyond any reasonable expectation, 5 days of holding a strategic crossroads that military logic said should have fallen within hours of the German arrival. Somewhere to the west, Allied commanders would have used this precious time to reorganize, to establish new defensive lines, to prepare counteroffensives that might ultimately turn the tide of the larger conflict. The 12 men of Hayes's unit, now reduced to the handful who still drew breath within these ancient walls, had written their paragraph in the vast narrative of the war. Not a decisive chapter, perhaps, but a testament to what determination could accomplish against overwhelming odds. The distant sound of engines cut through the sporadic gunfire, a mechanical growl that at first seemed to signal the arrival of the German armor that would deliver the final blow to their resistance. Hayes exchanged a look with Sergeant Ross, both men silently acknowledging that they had reached the end of their remarkable stand, when Private Wilson called out from his position near the shattered rose window. Lieutenant Hayes, those aren't German engines." His voice cracked with emotion as he pressed his face against the broken glass. "Those are Shermans, sir, American tanks, at least a dozen of them coming up the western road." Hayes scrambled to the window, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten as he strained to see through the gathering dusk. There, unmistakable against the darkening sky, were the silhouettes of Sherman tanks leading a column of American infantry, their advance preceded by an artillery barrage that was now falling on the German positions surrounding the village. Through some miracle of timing or strategic reassessment, the reinforcements they had never expected had arrived at the final possible moment, transforming their last stand from a doomed sacrifice into the pivotal defense that had held just long enough for relief to arrive. As the realization spread among the defenders, A ragged cheer rose from American and French throats alike, the sound echoing through the battle-scarred church like a prayer of thanksgiving finally answered after 5 days of impossible courage against overwhelming odds.